Y'all sent me a fucking dildo. God damn it.
On the last tour in the States, we had a lot.
Yeah, well, there was that girl brought us a physical page copy.
This is not fanfic.
And we're like, okay. Like after we read it, we're like, this is absolutely.
Hi, my name is Blake, and I no longer have access to a widescreen TV, projector, or computer. Never let it be said that I am not a very dedicated gay person. Anyway, let's be normal, please. This is my video about fandom being, let's say, disrespectful, weird, cringe, even, when it comes to the world of, basically, RPF, or, let's say, dedication. Now, this started when I was rewatching the Austin Night unboxing videos, and this moment happened.
Someone sent me a marriage certificate. Okay, they want me to sign it. Uh-oh, okay, and they've got a story too. I'll get to that.
But it has gone on to be very difficult to keep off the track of deeply ingrained sexism and pedophilic tendencies within the scene, and trying my best not to go completely historical, trying to keep this to the internet era. Now, just to vet my credentials a little bit more, I'm going to say that I'm coming at this from a place of love. I'm one of you. Let's be normal, not you be normal. We're in this together. So here's where I'm coming from. Most of this information is going to be through the view of fandom surrounding musicians, bands, that kind of culture and world, because that is what I'm most familiar with, especially at this moment, and the thing I've been most dedicated to amongst all my years. Here I've made a cute little timeline from 2017 to the present. Now here is where I ran into my first problems with trying to avoid making a serious video. But as we continue with our initial half of the video, which is just disclaimers, let's think about not hating women. Because in general, most of the cultural attitude towards fandom, I believe, comes from a deeply ingrained place of sexism and internalized sexism. Because TLDR, teenage girls aren't allowed to like anything. Let's think about this. Let's think about One Direction. Cringe, right? Everybody hated them. They think of the teenage girls at the concerts squealing, and they make this joke for all eternity. Flatten this interest to purely be sexual, and discredit the interests of women once again by refusing to accept and understand the gravity of female interests. And yes, I say female as a trans guy because, let's be honest, most of these spaces are filled by women. That can have its own video about why fandom creating a safe space online and toxic masculinity being a border into things. I don't want to make that kind of video right now. We're just going to accept that online fandom is mostly, not all, mostly filled by teenage girls. And most of this behavior is going to be from teenage girls. As I said, with flattening these interests to purely sexuality comes the villainization of female ownership of sexuality. You first say that interest is all about sexuality, and therefore say that it is completely invalid and something to mock. Meanwhile, in the view of male sexuality, let's think about teenage boys. Let's look at this case study. Jennifer's Body, a horror movie that came out in 2009. Also, yes, fandom reference here. This is New Perspective by Panic at the Disco. This came out and was mostly surrounding feminist themes. However, part of this presentation was the irony of having a femme fatale type character in Megan Fox be the lead and weaponizing that sexuality against predators. However, men saw this movie and completely took away all of the depth and layers of this movie and just decided to take what they wanted, which was sexy girl showing boobs, thus bringing a primarily objectifying male gaze to this movie. Anyway, let's talk more about teenage girls. Here is the part where I tried very hard not to get historical. So when we say teenage, it's important to keep in mind that this pubescent era is children, not fully developed, not completely societally aware, and in an isolated space. But this naivety and passion amongst that community of younger women is a breeding ground for predatory behavior by the people that they look up to. Let's remember the 1980s. Let's remember 15-year-old groupies. Let's remember and then acknowledge that it's still happening, but not so much. So TLDR, we've been here before, but all of this is to reiterate that this is not what I'm talking about. I'm purely talking about the internet craziness and common sense of very specific groups that I often encounter because I am in these groups. So it's very important, we're blaming them. We're not blaming us. As more current examples of this, Warped Tour. I'm gonna insert that one clip from TAI TV here. And then let's all think, this was probably taken advantage of by lame dudes that finally felt cool for once and were on an extreme ego trip and were desperate to take advantage of that opportunity and feeling all cool to have groupies that were like 14. Let's also remember, I forget his name, but that guy from My Digital Escape, you remember that? You remember when he literally went to jail? I think he's still in jail. I'm not gonna play the twerking tutorials that he made, but I want you to know that they exist and I had to watch them. So this is the culture that was often cultivated, this kind of societal normalization and kind of bastardization of that by the people to welcome it is kind of what led to the origins of this hellscape that then kind of mirrored back into what we're talking about. This is Motley Crue, by the way. Now, we've talked about cultivated culture, but what does that really mean? This is the culture that I was talking about. It's the early 2000s, and the internet is relatively new, and online fandom spaces are starting to develop, but in very isolated pieces, and it's the beginning of development of internet etiquette and boundaries. Things were being figured out. This was the age of the Snake Wives. This was the age of that Lord of the Rings thing that I don't want to talk about. It was basically horrors. And as I said, it was very isolated because there weren't an abundance of mainstream social networking sites. So it happened mostly on isolated fan forums that were unreachable by the general public. So it consisted specifically of these people deep into fandom, and thus creating echo chambers where nobody could come in with a normal point of view and say, hey, what the fuck are y'all doing? What's going on here? As some examples from here of the kind of culture that I have borne witness to in my research of this era as a Fall Out Boy fan and MCR fan. This was actually something I encountered while making my Peaky video essay, but at that point I censored it. Now you're here and you have to deal with this just like I did. On the Fall Out Boy website, they ran some Q&As. This is 2 P1s submitted by young people. 1, we want to have sex with Broadway. And I mean full-blown pumping his gas while he is handcuffed to the bed sex. Care to hook a couple of sisters up? And the answer was very nicely and clearly uncomfortably talking about Mikey Way and just choosing to ignore that and say something else, which good on him. Peter, would you ever date somebody 13 years younger than you, or at least be friends with them? P.S. You are hot and I love you. Now, let's think about this. This came from the year 2005, as it is peaky evidence. Now at this point, Pete Wentz was 26. Let's do some math. 26 minus 13 is 13. This ask was submitted by a 13-year-old, which is weird. It's also a weird question. These are weird questions. Wouldn't these questions make you uncomfortable if you're just trying to talk about your music? Nobody wants to hear this. Well, let's keep in mind the type of person that Pete Wentz was at this time, because we too often forget about the fact that he had a 4-year-long relationship with somebody named Janae, who she was 15 when they first started dating, and he was 23. When he was 23, 2 years before this ask was sent, he dated a 15-year-old. Okay, now we move on to the 2010s. This era I like to refer to, for jogging some memory, as Dan and Phil went through so much and I feel so bad for them. I can't even watch any of their videos anymore because all I think about is how much they were victims of the internet. Now, this is when, of course, that predatory behavior that we were talking about before still exists, but it is now more so warped onto the other end, and because it is continuing to be mostly teenage girls, this is 10 years later. So now this is a new generation, but the structure of these fandom spaces has been inherited from those older generations. So it has changed some, but we gotta remember where this is coming from. So it has some similarities to that. And places where this came off were in some hallmarks of the era when you think about this kind of thing, which, to jog your memory, would be Tumblr, Wattpad, and Snapchat. Also AO3, but to a lesser extent, for the audience we're talking about a Wattpad audience. Now, these are once again dedicated, mostly fan spaces, but they were differentiated from more common space. You wouldn't see, Ryan Ross would not have a Wattpad account, is basically what I'm saying. So they're able to do these things, but in a more isolated space. And this brings me to online accessibility. Because it's no longer in hard to find forums, it is more accessible to welcome more people into this online fandom space and creating an easier pipeline with a kind of slower indoctrination process. And this is because of the rise of social media. Now, as a person currently engaged in fandom, I access most of this through different social media platforms, mostly, I'm gonna be honest, through YouTube and Instagram. The Fall Out Boy and Water Perks fandoms on Instagram are so good. I don't care. But this means that I do not have to go to separate places to engage in these things. It is more integrated into everyday life and therefore more accessible, especially for people that are less familiar with the internet interface, as platforms have become easier to use. You don't have to figure out how to use LiveJournal. So now that this has strengthened and had the ability to grow these communities to a bigger scale and introduce people that would not necessarily have been in these spaces otherwise, they're kind of less dedicated. They get introduced to it and is very quickly able to learn more and become more involved without necessarily having time to completely recognize, get to know, be familiar with things. So this kind of increases the accessibility of surface level interest, or what I'd like to call, remember that one-sided sexuality that was brought to these things? That made that easier to express. And now we're brought to Periscope and live streams. These places also made it easier to bring fandom to where the actual creators were. You didn't have to send fan mail anymore, and creators didn't have to set up a PO box to receive fan mail. You could just go to their Twitter account, and they were doing live streams, which meant that it was unfilterable in the mostly pre-Twitch days. But let's remember Periscope. All of those clips that you remember, Dan and Phil horrors, what now mostly happens on Instagram Lives, that was Periscope. Periscope was hell. I remember the Panic at the Disco Periscope live streams that everybody was exhausted in because they didn't want to be there. I've encountered it in my Dallin Week's research, okay? That video is coming soon. I've been working on it for a year. I'm just trying to figure out an ethical way to do it to not be like this. So you could now get unsolicited comments from people if you were one of these creators and artists live streaming. And you didn't have to go and seek out these more hidden forums to be confronted with this. However, these more hidden things did exist. This is kind of our reflection back on the Snape Wives days, except now more people can come to it in a more slow descent before they reach the realm of Snape Wives things. It is also, to the general public, if they do know about it, more of a storied thing. You can't just look up Harry Potter forums.com. You have to dig. You have to be on Tumblr and deep into Tumblr and get in there to find these places. So that dedication makes it mostly home to intense fans. But the part that is known by the general public and the artists is the entrails of that seep into these limited spaces of actual interaction. So I like to think of this as like a hive of a bunch of insane people, and that's cool. You have your hive. I love hives. The problem is when one little bee flies out of the hive and then brings a bunch of bees with it and brings this isolated fan space which contains a lot of things to the artist that the hive was formed around, that the artist doesn't need to know about the hive. You don't have to make them hear that. And that's my issue. My issue is escaping the hive and bringing it to the people. Dan and Phil were victims. Now, you may be thinking, Blake, you're just going on and on, and I don't completely know what you're talking about. They're not making much sense. And I agree. But to clear things up, let's do a couple of case studies. These are more extreme ones that I'm actually talking about, but I just think they're very interesting and I need to talk to them. The Patrick Stump example, which I will get to, is more of what I mean by this typical unnormalness that I'm trying to educate about. So I mentioned One Direction before. This phenomenon, these victims that were widely mocked, and mostly what we hear about from it is them being crazy. And I am now going to broadcast the most crazy of this group. But I would like to clarify, most of them were not like this. This is just the outliers, blah, 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 blah. But I do think it's funny to talk about more mainstream examples with a wider audience and the level of crazy that they could be with more mobilized soldiers. Now, the main thing we have here that I knew going into this was all of the security camera hacks. I'm talking hacking the cameras in elevators to watch them in the elevator. I'm talking hacking the cameras of airports to watch them getting off a plane and get their luggage, etc. And also hotels. That's the thing I had heard the most about, was people hacking security cameras just to watch them like walking down a hallway. I mean, whatever, they were just doing things to get that just one more little tiny bit of content that they could juice out of these people. This is fine, I just thought this was funny. I found it in like a little listicle. Stay strong. They weren't giving this to them, so you could have this. This is the part that I like. You weren't given, this was for you and the other teenage girls, and I think that's wonderful. I think you deserve to have this, because stay strong. Now, this is what I'm talking about when I talk about extreme case studies. One Direction fans steal Liam Payne's boxers and try to break into his room. Two girls steal Payne's pants from his hotel balcony in Australia, wear them for a day, and then give them back. Let's be so for real. As I said, most of this was not our fault, but this was our fault. Let's be normal. Again, most people were normal, but this is fun to talk about, and I want to talk about it. And you don't need to wear his underwear. You just don't. Now, as I am ashamed to admit, the less mainstream things are full of more crazy people, and we may not have as many mobilized, but we do have a higher possibility of these kind of people being here. And so we just get one-offs like this. You know, it's not a big deal, but there is a reason why Ross isn't on the internet anymore, and I think about it so often, and I feel so bad, because you're not gonna fucking believe this, and I just need an excuse to tell somebody about this, because not enough people know about this. I forget about it sometimes, and once every fucking 2 months, I remember, oh god, poor Ryan, oh my god, what did they do to these children? So, let's talk about it. This is what happened. An adult fan extensively stalked the band and their family, and through multiple acts of manipulation, stolen identity, hacking, and a few Facebook accounts, this person gained access to the family space of these people and eventually got Ryan Ross's personal phone number. And I'd like to clarify that this happened in 2010-ish, a point right after the original split of Panic at the Disco, when Ryan Ross and Brendan Urie had a large falling out and were not seeing each other in person. So this person attempted to fix this, rekindle this friendship that had obviously ended so traumatically. And they impersonated Brendan Urie for 9 months. They knew enough about him through all of this stalking and like prior research that they were able to successfully pretend to be Brendan Urie and talk about all this information that one would think only he would have, no fan, to Ryan Ross for 9 months, gaining extremely personal information and fucking tormenting him. Imagine you're like, I would leave the internet forever. Oh my god, I would be so overwhelmed. Eventually, they were discovered. And during this time, they posted screenshots of these text conversations for everybody. they posted screenshots of this information, completely exposing these deep personal emotions. The layers to this, just a lot of times when you think about these things, you can say, well, they're on Twitter, they knew this was happening, they consented to this, basically. Eventually, though, after these 9 months, this person was discovered by somebody else who reported all this information to Ryan Ross's manager, who told Ryan, and oh my fucking god. Also, in my research about this story, I found a Tumblr post that, while introducing this subject, wrote the line, I won't go into it, but essentially Ryan Ross left and then the band imploded several times, and I was just Brendan Urie making shitty mindless pop music, which is basically a very concise and wonderful way of putting all the information and history you would ever need to know about Panic at the Disco. I would add that at one point he did have that weird little puppet, and that was the end. Last thing, because we're talking about Ryan Ross now, here's my Halloween costume from last year. I was 2005 era Ryan Ross during the Nothing Rhymes with Circus tour. I thought it was cute, and I was like, this is so niche, but I'm having fun. I posted it online. 3 separate people I knew had the same Halloween costume as me. If that doesn't show the deep levels of insanity that I'm at, that I knew 3 other people dressing up as Nothing Rhymes with Circus tour Ryan Ross for Halloween, I don't know what does. Last case study, we're talking about Patrick Stump. And this is more what I mean in general when I'll come across things and I'll be like, this is so uncomfortable. Can you guys just not? Can you not do this? Now, Patrick Stump had a Twitter account from 2010-ish to 2014-ish. Had. You did this. You ruined this. I'm just kidding, he just kind of got tired of being on the internet. He's never really been much of a social media person. But I don't think this helped. And going through the interactions, it was very timely and like didn't seem to be all that bad from his perspective. But just me looking at it as an outsider, I was like, this is weird. I mean, I know, but this is weird and I don't like it. But to the things that actually actively made him uncomfortable. We had the person saying, boxers or briefs? He said, my boxing career would be very brief. Yes. And we'll become familiar with these kind of answers to uncomfortable questions that are obviously trying to make light of something, but also clearly avoid these questions. And underlyingly say, don't fucking ask me that. We also have this person, do you ship Petrie? This is exactly the type of thing not to say to somebody. And in reply we have, I don't ship. I have a FedEx account, but I'm rarely home to use it. And I edited it out, but at the beginning of this chain was the person saying, do you ship Fan? No response. Replying, do you ship Petrick? Oh my fucking god, shut up. Oh my, I guess I have a FedEx account, but I'm not home to use it. Please shut the fuck up. And finally, when asked about fan fiction, once again, we reached a breaking point in an absurdly polite man. It is hard to get here. And this is not the deepest rage that one could possibly think of, but you have to think about it. All that came before and all of the chill that he had, you did it. Haven't and won't read them. Kindly don't ask me about them, please. It's okay to talk about them, just not with me, please. If he had to say it, you shouldn't have been doing it. Stop harassing the substitute teacher. You always do this. Now we have reached the end of the case studies and are ready to talk more about why are we like this? Why do we do this? Why do we continue to do this? Don't send Austin Knight a marriage certificate. That's creepy. Now, this helpful diagram here of a person putting on a persona to eventually become a clown, and you will see a clown. But you have to remember that that clown is not actually real. That is a person who has put on makeup, put on more makeup, put on a little wig, and so they appear as something else. But you're seeing the clown. You're not seeing this guy. If you see a clown, you probably won't be able to suss out what the person playing the clown actually looks like in day-to-day life. You don't know these people. These are assumed characters. The parts of this person that you can view through the limited appearances that they have through interviews, other media, stage presence, etc. Now, one of my favorite examples of this to give is when, not to brag, but I had VIP when I saw IDK How. I'm a man of the people. I am one of you. I just have my shit together a little bit more. So I had VIP for IDK How, and there was a little Q&A session beforehand. And you could tell during that time that he was more of a normal person that we were seeing this glimpse of, and he was just kind of chilling, answering questions, making some jokes. But this was mostly just a guy. It was lovely. But then, later on in the night, when he was performing, his stage presence was a completely different person. He was cocky, he was overconfident, he was controlling the room. But we know, through this complete shift in personality, that the person that he was playing to put on a good show while he was on stage was as an entertainer. He's not like that day to day. And this should seem obvious, but just to clarify, he's also said specifically in interviews before, please don't think that I'm like that. That's just all of the worst parts of me that I bring to the forefront when I'm on stage. I'm not actually an asshole off of stage. And I feel like that's been made very clear. But this is just one person that makes it more clear, the separation between who they really are and the person themselves that they present to the general public. And this type of illusion is not always fully understood by the fan base. You don't know Pete Wentz. I'm sorry, you don't know Austin Knight. Shocker, but it's an illusion. I'm sorry. And I think this is where we come to understanding the reality of parasociality and where that comes from outside of the little internet buzzword of parasocial relationships. Because it extends so much outside of that, in that it is inherent to interactions between an artist and the people that enjoy their work. Because, let's think about that wording. The people who enjoy their work, not the people who enjoy them. And that is where we come to this interaction that has been altered, because it's two parties only seeing one part of each other and being able to control the specific parts of themselves that they're putting forward in this limited view. And so para messed with social people. Messed with people. There's also this kind of unchecked objectification. You're not gonna see a ton of people there that's like, actually, this is a whole person, you shouldn't be saying that. Which they shouldn't in those spaces, because shut up, they're not even here. But that does sometimes create the illusion that this behavior is acceptable outside of those hidden hive moments. So now we're gonna be talking about, you're not necessarily bad people though, because sometimes it's okay when that objectification is checked and it has become clear through the artists themselves that this is okay within the boundaries that have been set. So let's talk about consensual weirdness. So to make things clear, here are some case studies of ways in which, and examples of artists who welcome this kind of thing sometimes. Now, this often, because we're talking about the online side of fandom, can come from interest from two places. Usually I like to think of it as older generations and newer generations, although this is not completely true, blah, 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 blah. But the interest can come from somebody who was in these online spaces and has now traveled up to be talked about in those spaces, but is still fundamentally coming from that place still. And so they have an interest because they know what's going on to say, what's going on about me? Because that would be exciting. Because if you're somebody that grew up on the internet and doing this kind of shit, and you end up being one of these artists, you might be curious and say, ooh, I've waited my whole life, I've been doing this, I want to know what you guys are saying about me. And that's the internal interest. And the external interest kind of, for me, starts more as an early 2000s thing where these people, nobody was raised in the internet, nobody had a deep understanding of it. And so it's kind of a Wild West. And you want to know what's going on there because you have no idea. And you're thinking, this thing is weird. I want to understand it more. I can separate myself from it and find it interesting from an external place. Anyway, these are my examples. So if you're not a water parks fan, or maybe you are and you've heard about this if you're insane in other ways, starting in, let's say 2018, there was a podcast between Austin Knight and his friend Travis Riddle, who he'd known through high school, who is like a fantasy book author, and they called it Austin and Travis's Slumber Party. As in, they're reading bedtime stories. You know, good night. They welcomed people to submit weird fan fictions that they had written, and then they would read them for this podcast. But you'll realize that they specifically started this space for it and asked for it for this specific circumstance where they could enjoy it. And they said multiple times throughout that they weren't coming from a place of mocking, they appreciated this. They were just having a little fun. I personally love this kind of thing. I love that that's a take on it that could be taken. It's kind of still going, but it stopped being that a while ago. Now it's just a regular podcast, and it's not available on Spotify anymore. You have to pay for the Patreon, where before you just pay for the Patreon if you want certain things. I've only listened to the first few seasons, and like very sporadically at that. But it's funny. It's fun. I think I like it. It's a good archive of a very specific era of fandom in like 2017 to 2019-ish, aka the Wattpad, Tumblr, and Snapchat era. Another thing is you might remember the infamous Twitter interaction with Gerard Way. Now, you might have to remember something else to start this, but I'm gonna assume if you're here, you know what the milk fic is. I'm not gonna explain it, but you probably know what it is. It was a Panic at the Disco weird fanfiction, whatever. But it's called the milk fic because it involves milk. And Gerard Way happened to change, at one point, his profile picture to a carton of milk and his name to Milk Friend. And then this interaction happened. He said, "Some people are saying that my new identity reminds them of a fanfic. I'm okay with that. I made my peace with fanfic long ago." Let's also remember the era Gerard Way came through, also remembered as the horrors era. I think Life on the Murder Scene talks about it. You should watch Life on the Murder Scene anyway. Next we have, I don't know what the fic is, but honestly, how bad is it? Are we talking about a milk enema? No big deal. And then he goes on to read it and give us little live tweeting updates. This fanfic gets right to the point. Absolutely no fucking around here. Milk enema, like I guessed. No big. And then coming back to this, to the audience with jaws dropped, shocked, wishing this had never happened, we get the nice little closure of, enjoy your fic. Write one about me and a human centipede with Escape the Fate. I don't give a fuck. I don't give a fuck. Now, this might not have started in the best place, but it was all in good fun. And this came from a place of external interest. What are you guys talking about? What's it? Oh, okay. Anyway, I thought people should know about that for historical appreciation. Where were you when the Gerard Way milk fic tweets dropped? I was at the zoo with my family. Blah, blah, blah. Time to repeat myself and more, but this is still different, I promise. We're gonna go back to IDK How. And we're gonna talk about how artists have at least some amount of control over the culture of their fan bases. Sometimes not, but sometimes they have the place where a fandom is at, because it ultimately stems from one creator, takes influence from that. And my example about this with Alan Weeks is he has always clarified his perspective on fan things as somebody that is a fan of things. One thing that I personally think about this was when he was setting up a VIP thing for his most recent tour, he was trying to figure out a way to do it that wouldn't feel exploitative of the people that supported him. And he pointed out something that I'm not completely sure how I hadn't thought about this before, but the soulless feeling of those kind of meet and greet lines where you go up, snap a picture, and move on, and how weird that was, and the commodification and objectification of a person, and you just get your picture for bragging rights and charging so much money for that, and it's just weird on all sides. And his personal talk about like meeting Queen and stuff, his perspective of a fan was always, I just want a handshake, like I just want to meet people. I would rather have that experience for myself than get a say nothing, take a picture, and walk away. And so this same person does something that I'm not imagining a lot of other artists could do. If you don't know, Alan Weeks used to have a band called the Brobecks, and they made a song called Visitation of the Ghost, which in the performance of this song, there is a long interlude in which they default to just the bass line and the crowd snapping to a beat and doing some vocal bits that he kind of conducts. And then at one point in this, he splits them down the middle to separate, and then goes down off the stage and walks through the middle of the crowd. And I have never a single time seen evidence or even talking about a fan being inappropriate with this. Everybody is respectful enough to keep chill, not try and grab him, approach him, or be weird in any way. And do you have any idea how insane that is? That is not something that could be done by Pete Wentz. They would eat him. And so this honestly incredible feat that he's able to repeat each night, you have to see the uniqueness of that as something that he made possible through who he is as a person. And for that, I conclude IDK How fans are the most normal and you should never complain about us, and we're the best ones, aren't we? Anyway, then I had another second where we're gonna think about, I mean, honestly, I know it's fake, it's staged, but it just makes me feel things deep inside, that one video from TAI TV.
Now, who would like to hear the record first?
Let's remember that. Let's see that contrast. Anyway, let's talk about our other case study of these things being put into motion with Katya Zamolodchikova. If you don't know, she is a drag queen who kind of has a persona that is kind of loose, crazy, kooky, wild. And at the beginning of her stardom, I guess, she would sometimes film and post videos from a dumpster that was right outside of her house. Some people used that footage of outside to find out where that dumpster was, and then through that, because the dumpster was right next to her house, find where she lived and show up there. And this brings us to a series of live streams where she talks about how she may have given him the impression that she didn't have a lot of boundaries through her persona, but clarifying to change these expectations and say, you cannot come to my house. I should have been more clear. Here is me stating a boundary. You can't come to my house, which should have been obvious already. But this is an example of a person actively changing perceptions and boundaries, which just goes back to cultivating these boundaries and these spaces. I just think it's an excellent show of how an artist can have some control over issues in their fandom and perception of them as a persona. Anyway, that's the end. This is probably gonna come out months from now because I suck at editing and I'm super slow and I don't have a computer, so it's all done on my phone on CapCut. But I hope you liked it. I hope you had fun. I know I'm mostly preaching to the choir over here, but sometimes it's good to watch somebody with your exact same opinion and feel vindicated and go, yes, you're right. Echo chambers. Aren't they a wonderful thing in fandom spaces?